Well, good evening and welcome to The Well. If we haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Danny. I'm one of the pastors here at our church and excited and glad you're here at one of our 4 Christmas Eve services. And as JT said, especially if it's your first time, it takes a lot of courage to come and try any church. And so we're just honored that you would join us and make this the place that you're spending Christmas Eve. And as odd as it might sound, as I was preparing for my Christmas Eve message, I was thinking about how odd it is that I am even standing here doing this, being a pastor. And there was a time where I never thought that I would be a pastor, but also a time where I wasn't sure that I would be a Christian. And so the idea that I'm standing here is odd to me. And as I was writing my message, that continued to pop and go through my mind. And it got me thinking, like, well, how did I get here? And what got me here was what I would call like one of those Mount Rushmore style moments, like those core memories that you call back to. Maybe you have one right now, like it's rattling around in your mind. You think back to this moment that didn't just happen to you. It wasn't something you just experienced, but something that shaped you and defined you, and not just the person you were then, but the person that you were becoming. And for me, one of those moments centered around a mentor of mine. He was my middle school youth pastor in my 7th and 8th grade year. I was not really familiar with religion at this point, but I went to this youth group and I got a chance to explore faith in religion, and it was interesting. He made religion not cool necessarily, but compelling for the first time in my life. And then when I went into high school, he moved off to Chicago. I was living in Oregon at the time. He moved to Chicago to go to seminary, and I kind of faded away from church. I didn't really go back, and I never really cracked a Bible open, never really studied. But then by happenstance, I went off to college, and this mentor of mine moved back to town. And he didn't just move back to town, he moved to the town that I was going to college in, and he didn't just move to the town that I was going to college in. He got a job at my university in the registrar's department, which was great because I was a terrible student and I needed someone to help me. And so he helped me through this year. But in this year, he also took a job as a youth pastor at a church down the road from where I was going to college. And I remember my sophomore year, he came up to me and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in interning at my church?" And I was like, "Well, I've never cracked my Bible open, so it seems like that might not be a great fit. Like, I don't know much about the story. I don't know much about this faith thing." And he's like, "Well, just give it a try." And so I gave it a try, and I spent my college years interning at this church, and it was amazing. Like, I opened my Bible for the first time. I studied these stories of who Jesus was and why he mattered. I got to know a story about this Jesus guy that I'd never heard before, and it shaped my life so much that I decided that I wasn't just interested in being a Christian, but I also wanted to go into pastoral ministry. And so I took a job across the country in rural Alabama, my first ever solo youth pastor job, and I flew across the country to take this job. But before I took it, I told my mentor that I was doing. They said, "All right, this is awesome, and I have one final project for you." And I imagined that the project would be like a sermon or something or a paper, and it wasn't any of those things, but it was quintessentially this person's style. We hopped in a car and we drove back to my hometown, and we got out of the car and I looked in front of me and I saw this railroad trestle. And I was like, "Well, what are we doing here?" He says, "Well, we're going to cross that. That's your final project." And I'm like, I'm not risk averse. Like, I take risks. I do risky things. And even I was like, "This is stupid, my guy. Like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we trying to go across this?" And he's like, "But we're going to do it." And next thing I know, I'm like halfway across this railroad trestle. And I don't know if you've ever been in one of these like height sensing moments where you're like walking across something or you're in one of these things. Like when the wind was blowing by, it wasn't just blowing, it was like ripping by. I was like, this thing's gonna blow me off. Every creak on the ground beneath me, on the trestle beneath me, felt like it was gonna break and bring both of us down together. And all the while, my heart is like beating out of my chest every step that I'm taking during this journey. And I'm like, man, this is going to be not only the dumbest way to die, but my mom is going to be so mad, and my obituary is going to be so embarrassing. This is going to be terrible. But every step, even though my heart's beating out of my chest, my mentor is leading me through this journey. And I say leading me, he was behind me, which was a weird place to lead from, but he was saying, like, "You got this. Like, keep going, one step in front of the other. You can do this." And I just kept taking a step and kept taking a step, and eventually we got to the other side of the railroad trestle. And this, for me, was like mission accomplished, Hall of Fame moment. It was a moment that would go on to define me and shape me. It's one that I would tell as a time of choosing faith over fear and courage, and it was objectively stupid. If we have anyone that like serves with our youth ministry, don't do this. And if you want to be, don't do this. It's a bad choice. But for me, it served as this like Hall of Fame, Mount Rushmore sort of moment. And I would go off to seminary. I used this. I wrote about this in my seminary admissions paper. When I went to go get ordained as a pastor, I told this in both my written and oral interviews as this formative moment in my life. And it was one that went on to shape me. Not one that I just experienced, but really shaped the person that I was becoming. And I imagine as I say that, you might have like your own version of that story rattling around in your mind, like this moment that you didn't just experience, but a moment that really shaped you, that defined you, whether it was a friend or a relationship, a mentor, a church, a moment you point back to and say, I didn't just experience this, but it shaped me and it defined me and it was a part of the person that I have become. And as important as these moments are, I don't know that we always give them the credit in the moment that they deserve. And certainly I thought this moment was important, but looking back on it, I don't even know if I knew how important it was. But then what happened is like years went on and years turned into decades and it turned into this longer season. And just recently, in the last year or two, I was confronted with a really uncomfortable truth about this mentor of mine that made me question everything about the relationship that we had, every moment that we shared, this really sacred moment for me of crossing this railroad track. So I remember going back and saying like, well, was any of this real? Was any of the things that we experienced, was this formative moment one where you were just manipulating an impressionable young man? Was I just a pawn in a larger game of chess that I didn't even know I was a part of? It made me question if you've ever had like one of those failures of mentors or friends or these moments that have fallen apart, it makes you question things. It makes you ask these really big and these formative questions, questions that you're not interested in asking and that you never prepared yourself to ask. And they're not like multiple choice questions. I couldn't read a book and I couldn't open up something and say, like, well, I'm going to try to find the easy, clear-cut answer. These are like deep inside, like spiritual soul level questions that I never really was able to find a super clear answer for. And there may be questions that you've asked before, again, about a friend or a relationship or a church or a belief system, that you look back and you ask these questions of like, what do I do with this thing that was once really powerful to me, once really formative to me, once really beautiful to me? It's provided safety and security and all of these things, and now is a sense of great pain and great anguish and great anger and every single negative emotion that you could conjure up. Like, what do you do with that? Do you go scorched earth and just burn the whole thing down? Like, do you just look like, man, we're going to take this whole thing down with me? Or do you stay and you just put on the good mask and you pretend like nothing happened? You just show up one day after another, like, all right, we're just going to do this all over again, and we're just going to try to make it work and pretend like nothing happened. And neither of those sounded like the right answer. And as odd as it might sound, and stick with me on this, this made me all think of the Christmas story. It really did. It made me think of the Christmas story, because when I was introduced to the Christmas story, the first time I ever went to a Christmas Eve service was actually 10 years ago this year when I moved to St. Louis. I came here to work at a job, but I never attended a Christmas Eve service in my life. And it was the first time I'd ever attended one. I was struck by how beautiful it was and how clean it was and how pristine it was. And if you've ever like driven down the highways, whether it's 70 or 64 or down your neighborhood streets, and you see the nativity scenes on the side of the road, right? Like you look and you see these nativities and you look around and it looks beautiful and it looks pristine and it looks wonderful, right? And that is what I was told the Christmas story was, this beautifully well put together, well manicured, pristine version of the story, the baby wrapped snugly in the manger, right? Like that's what I was told the Christmas story was. And I'll quickly say, if that is the Christmas story you know and you are experiencing, hold on to that. That is a version of the Christmas story. That is a beautiful version of the Christmas story, and one that sometimes we need. Like when we can't exhale or we can't breathe or we can't find goodness, like that is an opportunity for us to find goodness and find joy. Like that story, that version of the story can provide something for us that maybe nothing else can. But what I would add is that's not the only version of the story that exists. That's not the only version of the Christmas story. And I want to provide you with perhaps an alternative version of the Christmas story, one that you haven't examined before. Maybe you have, or maybe if this is your first time ever in church, or you've only been presented with the really polished version, maybe it's your first time ever examining it, but a Christmas story that is not about all these neat pieces put together, but a story that centers around an unwed teenage mother, that any one of those things in her culture and context, for Mary being unwed, being teenage, and being pregnant, would have been pretty brutal on their own, but together was like a holy trifecta of doom. Like those things would have not served her well in her culture and context. The story centers around her. It also goes around this guy named Joseph, the fiance of Mary. This guy who's wondering, what does he do? Like, how do I love and support my partner well? How do I believe this miraculous pregnant story? How do I do whatever the right thing is? in the midst of this story that seems pretty confusing to me. Like, how do I do that? And in the midst of all of this, there is this oppressive king, Herod, who is preaching a world of violence and pain and tyranny and division and anger and anguish around the community that is existing around Mary and Joseph, the community that Jesus is born into. And as much as we sing Silent Night, and that song means a lot to me and is beautiful to me, Jesus wasn't born into a beautiful, pristine world. He was born into a world of chaos and brokenness and anger and anguish and uncertainty and sorrow and pain everywhere that is around. And then when Jesus was born, it wasn't like Mary and Joseph took a wonderful baby moon to the Hamptons. Like they didn't go on a vacation. They packed up everything that they had and they fled to a different country, crossing borders and lines so that they could just survive another day being refugees in another country, trying to just keep safety for themselves and for this newborn baby that they had. And friends, like that's a authentically raw and real version of the Christmas story. There's nothing neat and tidy and clean about that version of the Christmas story, but that is the Christmas story. And what that tells me and what I think that means is that if you don't feel like your story is like neat and tidy and clean, and your story isn't polished and beautiful, like that is a wonderful thing, because that means you were the same person that the Christmas story existed with and exists with and for today. Like you are not outside the Christmas story, you are centered into the story that has always been the Christmas story. And this sort of like reorientation of the Christmas story actually helped me understand this failure of my mentor better, because I had to reorient the story, right? Like I looked at this story of this person that was really valuable to me, and for a while I gave them every piece of power, intentionally and unintentionally, to own my story and to be a part of my story and to be the author of the things that were going. But when I look back and say, like, as I reorient my story, like there were some really beautiful, good things happening in this story, and he was not the author of those. He just happened to intersect with those. He wasn't the driver of those things. He was just a participant in those, and his failure and his manipulation and these things that he did in my life that caused me a lot of pain and grief actually didn't take away the beautiful things that God was doing in the midst of my story. This failure of this person didn't remove the beauty of my story that was being written in that moment. But just a few days ago, I went to a coffee shop, and I was getting ready to like pull up my sermon slides. I was Googling this railroad trestle. I've not been back to Oregon in like 10 years now, and I haven't been back to this railroad trestle in many years. And so I go and I sit down, I'm like, well, I got to get a picture of this so people can visualize what it is. And so I type in Sherwood, Oregon railroad trestle, and this is the first thing that pops up on the screen. This thing burned down. And you might be looking like, well, I looked at the picture, of course it burned down. But it burned down. And before I laughed, and I did laugh, like a laugh of like irony, like of course it burned down. But before I laughed, my stomach dropped. Because this was the only redeemable good piece of the story left for me. Like my mentor failed me, and the memories started to be failed, and everything was getting tainted in this, and this stupid railroad trestle was the only remaining good part of the story for me. It was the only redeemable piece of that story, because as bad as the decision making was and as irresponsible as any of it was, like I could go back and say, like, this was a moment, as irresponsible or silly or misguided as it was, that shaped me in the person that I was going to become. And even that burned down. And not like sermon illustration burned down, like it literally burned down. And I wish I could say that I knew this and I had planned this when I wrote this. I had a very different ending to this message. But it burned down. And I was thinking, like, isn't that the most honest thing that could have happened, right? We live in a world that is broken from like the biggest level to the smallest level, and things just break. And things get burned down. And things that really were valuable to us don't always last forever, whether those are relationships or memories or moments or whatever. Like, things sometimes collapse. And as painful as it was to see that as the ending of this for me, like in some ways it felt like the most authentic ending to this memory in this moment. And a moment that for a long time was the number one story I told, and then it was one that I didn't want to ever look at again. And as I decided to revisit it for today, I saw that it all came down. But what didn't burn down as this trestle burned down was what God was doing in the story of my life in that moment. And when we go back to the Christmas story, like everything is burning to the ground for Mary and Joseph and all of the characters in this. Like things are burning to the ground in this Christmas story. Mary is this unwed teenage mother who is questioning what God is doing in a world that finds no value in her. But God's story, the Christmas story, says God is with her. There's Joseph trying to figure out, like, what do I do and how do I love this person well? And he has doubts and he has questions and he's skeptical of what God is doing. But the Christmas story says God is with Joseph. My favorite character, the one I resonate the most with in the Christmas story, but you may or may not be familiar with, is Zechariah and Elizabeth. Those are the aunts and uncles of Jesus. And Zechariah is more or less a pastor, and he's committed his life to waiting for the coming Messiah. Like he has committed his life to this. And an angel of the Lord shows up to him and says, hey, the Messiah is coming. And he's overcome with doubt, and he doesn't believe. And he freezes in this moment that he's been dreaming for, that he's committed his whole life for. He freezes. In the Christmas story, God says that I am with you. His wife Elizabeth, who has been living a life of peppered disappointment, waiting and prolonged joy, and even though it's prolonged, the joy eventually comes, but her doubt and her fear and her disappointment is there, and God says that I am with you even in the disappointment. And in the midst of all of that, we see Herod, this power-hungry, insecure, violent leader who is the backdrop of everything that is happening, willing to hurt whoever is in his way so that he can get more power and stay in more control. And what I love about the Christmas story is it does not sterilize his violence, it does not romanticize it, and it doesn't pretend like it doesn't exist. It doesn't pretend like he's not trying to burn things down around Mary, Joseph, Jesus, and the entire Christmas story, but it says that even in the midst of that happening, that God is with the participants of the Christmas story. The faithful, the scared, the exhausted, the disappointed, the overlooked, the outsider, the marginalized, the doubter, those still trying to believe and those unsure if they ever can. Again, the Christmas story says God is with them, like God is with you. The Christmas story didn't avoid them. It happened right in the midst, in the middle of them. And one of the things that has shifted for me as I've revisited this Christmas story in the light of my own story and just examining it is the Christmas story does not say everything is fine. The Christmas story in no way says everything is fine. It actually says the opposite, says everything is not fine. But it says in the midst of that, God is still going to make God's dwelling place among us and going to be with us and going to be an active participant in putting the broken things back together. Like that's what the Christmas story says, that God is not with some of us, God is with all of us. God is not just with the best version of us, but God is with just us. And in this participation, in this proximity to us, God is putting these broken things back together. And so this Christmas, if your story feels like it's broken or it's burning down or it feels like there's very little hope and there's very little goodness, it's hard to trust and it's hard to believe both in God or in people, the good news of the Christmas story is God says, I am with you and I have never stopped being with you. And my hope is this Christmas that can be the story we celebrate not just today and not just the month of December, but the entire year as we celebrate a God that is not just with some of us, but with all of us. And a God that is interested in not keeping the world as it is, but interested in putting these broken pieces back together. Would you pray with me? God, I do thank you that you're a God that sees things that to us look broken, things that look like they're irredeemable and have been burned down, and you, God, resurrect them and breathe new life back into them. And so, God, for those of us that maybe come in bruised and broken and hurting, full of doubt and uncertainty, I just ask that you would help us not believe again and not hurry to healing, but just feel a sense of your presence and relief and an ability to exhale and to believe that as we wander through this journey of life, that you are near and you are with us. And so, God, as we prepare our hearts to receive communion, the ultimate sign of your presence and your proximity to us, I just ask that you would help us draw closer to you and closer to one another. To believe that the Christmas story is not something thousands of years that we celebrate, but an active moment happening in our midst every single day. So be with us as we continue to worship, prepare our hearts for communion. Pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.